If this is the first time you're seeing me, hello, my name is Bront'e. I'm a language coach. I help language learners create consistent study routines so that you can really just start using the language that you're learning. And this is both coming from personal experience and from the work that I do, that so many of us get caught up in studying and nerding out and geeking out around the studying and the grammar and the vocab and following a textbook and listening to a podcast. We forget the goal is to use it. The goal is to say, I am learning this language for a purpose. Now let's do that thing. So we talked about the language learning audit, and now I want to switch over to one of my favorite strategies, not the most favorite, because I don't even know if I could list those in order, but one of my favorites, which is laddering languages. So if you've watched me for any length of time on TikTok, YouTube, I'm literally everywhere on the internet, I absolutely love laddering languages. It is one of my favorite strategies, especially as a polyglot, especially as someone who is learning multiple languages, because one of the very first challenges that you face when learning multiple languages is, how do I balance them? How do I keep up with language A, language B, language C, and I'm trying to start language D over here? How do I keep track of all these things? Laddering languages is essentially using one non-native language to help you learn another one. So I'm going to give examples. I'm going to break it all down. If you're like, Bront'e, that still makes zero sense to me, do not worry. It's really about using a language that you are actively learning, one that you know really well, one that you would consider yourself fluent in, whatever fluency means to you. For me, I think of conversational fluency, conversational, even in writing. So like I can converse or talk to someone in a text comfortably. I can talk to someone out loud comfortably. Any of those levels, whatever level that makes sense to you. And this helps for a few different reasons. One, laddering languages really eliminates you relying heavily on your native language. So for me, when I was learning every single language exclusively through English, my native language, if I didn't understand anything, I always went back to English, which meant I was doing a lot of translation. And if you've been learning languages for a while, you know that translation, unless you are actively trying to become a translator, which is a separate skill, translation is not the best thing to do long-term. It's a great short-term strategy. It helps you to understand how sentences work, how to create sentences, the structure of them, all of these things. But in the long term, it is not a great strategy to learn because you're constantly going to be translating in your head. And that's going to slow down your process of understanding what someone else is saying, your process of understanding text, and the process of you speaking. Like every time someone talks, you're going to sit there for a moment. Okay, what's this word? How do I say this word? Okay, how do I put that in? That word goes there. And then I conjugate it this way. And now you say the word. That took you like 10 seconds. And if every time you have to speak, it takes you 10 seconds to get a word out, it's going to be frustrating for both people involved, everyone involved. We don't want that. Laddering languages is also really good because I like to think of it as like a micro step before dipping your toes into monolingual learning, which is essentially learning the language in the language. I love to do this. I listen to podcasts that are, for example, mostly I do this with, actually, no, I do this in all the languages, I think. Yeah, all the languages I'm learning at this point, even when they're beginner level. But there are like some YouTube videos where they're teaching Japanese grammar in Japanese. They're teaching me French vocabulary in French. They're explaining a cultural point, in Spanish instead of using English. I absolutely love those resources. And this is monolingual learning. You're learning it in the language. You're learning the language in the language that you are learning, if that makes sense. So again, Spanish content, teaching you Spanish. French content, teaching you French. And so before you get to that step, a lot of people, it's a struggle to get there. You're like, I don't know if I'm ready to exclusively use just this one language to learn and make progress. Then you can use another language that you're a little bit more confident in. And this can be, a beginner language, but a language that is really close to or familiar to you, close to your native language or familiar to you. So for example, you could say, I'm studying Spanish and French. They are both beginner languages, but I have a lot of I understand a lot of Spanish already because I've been exposed to it for years. So that might be the base of your ladder, and you're using Spanish to help you with French. Both beginner languages, but Spanish is helping you with French. Now, you might say, I've never studied either of these languages before. I, have no contact with them until this point, and I'm going to use French to help with my Spanish. You could do that if that is a level of frustration that you can handle, because there's a threshold part we can handle. That's a good, fun challenge. And then the part where it makes us want to quit. We don't want to get there. If that's a level of frustration that you can handle, go for it. The recommendation, what I usually say, is a language that is at intermediate level and a language that is more beginner. So something that you can, if, for example, French is the language that you're trying to learn right now, you're using Spanish to help you learn French. But every time you look up the French word in Spanish, you don't even understand the definition in Spanish. So then you have to look up that in English. If every single time you're doing that, I would pause. Unless that is a level of frustration you can handle. I cannot. That would bother me. I would quit. So that's why I don't recommend it. And then the other thing is, when you're laddering languages, it really helps you to maintain other languages. So if you're like me, you're juggling 3, 4, 5, 6 plus languages. Laddering languages makes it easier to maintain because you're not using your native language, but you're using another one. And you get to decide how these all play out and what connects to what. But it's helping you stay in contact with at least one other language that you are not actively studying. And if you've ever studied 3 or more languages, you know that sometimes it can be really tricky to balance multiple languages. That's my spiel about how it helps. But now I just want to talk about how I kind of said it already, but I wanted to sort of detail it by telling you what my ladders look like in multiple languages. So the base of mine is English. Wait till one language is intermediate level and then start. That's what I recommend. But again, if you are someone who's like, Bront'e, I want to ladder these 2 languages because these are languages that I want to maintain, and I have a decent enough understanding of this one that I can get by, go for it. Everything that I do in my coaching with people is do what works best for you. So even if I'm saying, I personally wouldn't do this thing, and here's why, because I don't like this. Just because I don't like it doesn't mean that you don't. So if you want to test it out with 2 different languages that are a little bit closer to beginner than they are to intermediate, absolutely try that out and just see. Because what we say in theory might be completely different than what happens in practice. But my personal recommendation is wait until you have practiced the language, you have like a solid-ish vocabulary, or you can at least get things through context, that when you see a definition, you generally understand what it's saying. That's what I like to do. So you start there, and my ladders, I did it strategically this way just because it made sense to me, but this is not the way to do it. So my base is English, and I have 2 different ladders because the connections is just what I've done. This is visual. So English helps me to learn Spanish. Anything that I need to look up that I don't understand in Spanish, I look it up in English. And then the next layer is French. So I learned French by looking up French resources that are written in Spanish. So I'll say like aprender francés, and I'll look that up on the internet, and then it'll give me, a website teaching grammar, but the only 2 languages it's written in is French and Spanish. That's it. Then the next one is French. I use that to help me with my Russian. So I literally looked up, there's a website, something like a Pon. It's just learn Russian. That's literally what it's called. And it is teaching Russian in French. And that's what I use. And then on the other side, I have English to help me with my Japanese. Japanese is helping me with my Korean. So anything in Korean that I'm trying to understand, I look it up in Japanese first. And then the Korean is helping me with my Mandarin Chinese. So anything that I don't understand in Chinese, I look it up in Korean. And then I have some languages that don't really fit that, but that's the general sort of order that I personally follow. And I did it strategically because I know Japanese and Korean grammar are very similar. Spanish and French are very similar. Russian was more similar to French and Spanish than it was to me, the Asian languages that I was learning. So I put it over there. That's just how I structured it. You've learned laddering some languages somehow it helps you to learn one quicker. Yeah. a lot of times it does, especially when you think of the strategy of saying, well, I'll give the example that I'm thinking of right now is like Japanese to Korean. If you already have a solid foundation in Japanese or Korean, when you decide to learn the opposite, the other. So if you have a solid foundation in Korean, you decide to learn Japanese, or you have a solid foundation in Korean and you decide to learn, I just mix it up. Solid foundation in Korean, you learn Japanese. Solid foundation in Japanese, you learn Korean, whatever order. They're so similar that when you understand the grammar, for example, in one of them, when you look at it in the other language, you're like, oh, I already understand what context it's used in. I understand how to use it in a sentence because it's so similar. You don't have to go through that extra hurdle of understanding the nuance. Yeah, so that's just my personal experience. And I've had a similar thing when I look at Spanish and French. So you plan to use Korean to learn Japanese. Yes, I think that's a great idea. And I can give you an example. This is the book that I always pull out when I'm showing this as an example. So this book here is one of the textbooks that I have. It is called Dekiru Kankokugo, which means like you can do Korean. And then it's the Chukyu level. So that's like intermediate. I've had this forever and I just come back to it every once in a while. This one specifically is the workbook. And then I have here is the textbook. So this book is entirely written in Japanese and Korean. So things are falling. So for example, this is a chapter that I've been working through. This is the reading. This is entirely in Korean. And then you come over here. This is the vocabulary. So vocabulary is written in Korean and in Japanese. There is no English, as far as I remember. Yeah. 0 English in this book. And so because this is also intermediate, it's using a lot more Korean than like a beginner version of this would use. But Korean and Japanese is what this book is written in. So I am learning and improving my Korean using Japanese. And then if there's a Japanese word in this book that I don't fully understand, I'm going to look it up in English, but the Japanese word in English. But this is keeping me in contact with Japanese. So on a day where I'm like, or a week where I haven't really studied much Japanese, I don't feel guilty about it. Well, I don't feel guilty about it anyway, but if there's a week where I haven't really actively studied much Japanese, I know if I've gone through this textbook, yes, I have. I've kept in contact and I've studied Japanese because there's Japanese in here that I'm reading or I'm listening to. Well, I don't think the audio has like Japanese and I think it's all in Korean. But if I'm using this book, I know that I'm actually doing 2 languages and not just one. And then I have some similar websites for other languages. Like I said, the website that's written in French, but is teaching me Russian. One of my absolute favorite strategies, but it is not for everyone. But I like to recommend it anyway because you try it out, you see what works, and because it's really versatile. So you could just say, I'm only going to do this with podcasts. I have some podcasts that are in Japanese and Korean. I have some that are in Spanish and French. You could just say, I'm only going to do this when looking up vocabulary, but the actual website, I'm going to stick to what I have. It doesn't have to be 100%. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. But the goal is that you're using this as an opportunity to add in a language that you are more familiar with or that you don't get into contact with as much as you would like to. And so it eases the pressure off of trying to balance multiple languages because you're like, hey, today I had to look in the dictionary for this word and the dictionary was not in English. It was in Mandarin today. So I studied a little bit Mandarin. Good job. Pat myself on the back. And sometimes we just need that. We need that little celebration, that win, to tell ourselves it's okay. And so that's one of the reasons why it's my favorite strategy. And I kind of talked about some of the different ways. So you can find text and resources that are teaching the language. You can use dictionaries that allow for looking between both. I think Word References is a good dictionary that has a lot of different ones that connect, and it's not just English to another language. Some apps that I love to do this with, Lingodeer, which I believe now is no longer free or no longer completely free. I don't know. I paid for lifetime almost 7 years ago. And so I just have lifetime access to everything. But that allows me to, I don't know if it'll show up on stream if I show it. Let me try to just put it in more context. So right now, I don't know if it's going to show up. Oh, it does. So this is Lingodeer, and you'll notice that all the text is in Japanese. So these are all the different languages. It's in Japanese. And I'm going to click on Kankokugo, which is Korean. So now I can choose the Korean lesson. And I'm just going to pick a random lesson. It literally doesn't matter what I choose, but I just want to make a point. So Korean's at the top. Then the Japanese is directly below it. There is no English involved in this process. So there are some apps that you can do that with as well. I know Lingodeer does it for most of the languages. Or you could get something like Rosetta Stone, which eliminates a second language altogether. But the point is just find one way that you can do this. You don't have to do all the things. Just find one simple way that you can incorporate this into your language studies to make it easier for yourself. You can write notes between the two languages. So maybe you're still using your regular resources to learn languages. You haven't found something that's using your non-native language. That's fine. But every time you write down notes, you're only writing the notes in one of those two languages. So if Spanish and French are the two that you're laddering, it's either in Spanish or in French. And then if you're learning a language that doesn't have many resources, because some of the people I work with are learning languages like Lithuanian. And so if you are coming across a language where they don't have many textbooks, many YouTube videos that you can watch and use to help with this, or like the apps that you're finding don't include it, then if all else fails, there's so many translators that are decent enough. Like you could go to ChatGPT and use that to help you, because I definitely did for languages that I'm not learning when I was creating the sentence building course that I created, because I wanted to give other examples, but I'm not learning all different kinds of languages. I tend to stick to naturally a few different types of groups. So Google Translate, Papago, there was a few that I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think in that course I listed 5 or 6 different ones. I just did a quick Google search. Translators other than Google Translate, and you're going to find some really good ones. I tested it out and, with a language that I was comfortable with to see what the translation was going to look like. I was like, hey, that's passable. That works. And so you could just do that and then use that as your laddering. You're looking up the translation of words between your two languages. So again, you can stay in contact. There's possibilities are endless. I'm just throwing out ideas. But again, the big goal is to do this so that you maintain, especially if you're learning more than one language at a time.